In The Sopranos, mob boss Tony Soprano suffers from panic attacks and as such regularly meets with therapist Dr Jennifer Melfi for him to better understand why he has these spells. Through these crucial therapy scenes, skipped only by stunades of the highest magnitude, we get an insight into the psyche of Tony Soprano, what he thinks that he doesn't say. We get an insight into his history and upbringing, and we also examine his evolution, or lack thereof, throughout the show. In my Why You're Wrong series, we take a look at movies, shows, seasons, or characters and offer an alternative opinion to the consensus. And today, I wanted to take a look at Dr. Elliot Kupferberg, a minor recurring character who is a friend and therapist of Melfi. Elliot is in around 13 episodes but has very minimal screen time, spread throughout the course of the show. He talks to Jen about Tony, advises that she should drop him as a patient, though seems very nosy about Mr. Mob Boss, bringing him up and wanting to discuss him more than his own actual patient. Like, what's his problem? It's her patient. Why is he so obsessed with Tony? And eventually, this blabbermouth cunt unethically makes a very insensitive comment about her patient to some friends of ours, also bringing up a study which Melfi reads and which causes her to finally drop Tony as a patient. This is something that could have caused Elliot to lose his license, malpractice which in an extreme case could even get him sent to prison where he'd spend his time catching, not pitching. Elliot, in spite of his limited appearances, is considered one of the least likable characters in the show. Before we get into that, it's worth mentioning he is quite an important character. Just like Melfi is a conduit for us to learn more about Tony's inner psyche, Elliot provides this for Melfi. He is Melfi's Melfi. Who watches the watchmen, as the saying goes, and Elliot is watching Tony's watchmen. Also, this is a topic for another day, but Sopranos creator David Chase, who has suffered from depression and has seen shrinks, has a lot to say about psychiatry, which he explored on the show. While he acknowledges they provide useful insight, there can also be a lot of vague waffling, blaming everyone aside from the patient, and it isn't an exact science. As a result, we see different therapists on the show, each with wildly different styles and levels of adequateness, from the older guy who saw right through Carmela's crap to the woman who completely bought into Janice's nonsense. And then there are those who feel the entire industry is nothing but a racket for the Jews. But frankly, if you've got that kind of covert anti-Semitism, I'd like you to leave the video. Like other Medigans in the show, Melfi too to an extent, Elliot seems to enjoy his own voyeuristic fantasy of Tony Soprano through Melfi. He was fascinated by him, enjoyed the exoticness, but also had the safety of distance. He was a mob junkie. His father was a rabid Untouchables fan, do with that what you will. And he was a literal armchair critic who fancied himself as a mafia expert but got basic things wrong. Like, who the heck is Augie Aprile? He calls Junior Buster and doesn't recognize Tony Soprano when he was crowding him with the car, thinking he was a parent or a repairman, even though Mr. Type A personality was wearing a custom suit, an indicator that Elliot is a dilettante, really out of touch, sitting up in his ivory tower. But he called the Santoro thing, you gotta give him that. Elliot is just a grating guy because he comes across as a sanctimonious, uppity, snobby douchebag who's more interested in Leadbelly than Jennifer's state of mind. He, Russ Fagoli, and Noah all feel like they went to slip and fall school together. His encounter with Tony, where he keeps driving up Tony's substantial ass, is a metaphor. It's like, how close can I get to this guy without being in any real danger? Which is exactly what he does in his therapy sessions. Plus, him not recognizing Tony highlights how clueless he really is about the mob. Perhaps he is one of many mirrors for the audience. On one hand, what we see in The Sopranos, these characters, are really screwed up. On the other hand, we can't get enough of it, much like Elliot. There's even a scene where he watches a mob news show on his TV, similarly to how we would have watched The Sopranos on our TVs. And then there's that damn water bottle. That mammoth, Rubenesque Goliath that rises up from the frame like a kraken. He unscrews when he could unclip, and then he slurps down that H2O like Janice would in a Boardwalk Empire cameo. There's something about that water bottle that is so irritating. It's so perfect for his character. Why's it got a mesh around it, like it was designed for commando operations? But it's perfect because it shows how ultra prepared he is and symbolizes how isolated from real danger he is. Water bottles should be like Michael Imperioli, quiet, there when you need them, and inoffensive. Elliot's, though, is like Steve Schirripa, butting in, invasive, in your face, and wanting to know if you've seen Milton Berle's cock. I feel like a lot of Elliot's characteristics were based off the actual actor playing him. Peter Bogdanovich is a Hollywood legend from the New Wave generation, a director with a really interesting story. I don't want to paint in somber tones, but he is known as someone who is quite full of himself, condescending and pretentious and smug. Bit of a poseur, you ask me. Even in the interview he did with David Chase, which was a great interview, his mannerisms don't seem too different from Elliot, right down to that cross-legged, chin resting on hand, quote-unquote intellectual way he sits. And would you believe it? The water bottle is not something thought up by the writers. It was actually Bogdanovich's own water bottle he used to carry around the set, something Chase noticed and incorporated into the show, something proven in a Talking Sopranos interview, and also, rather bizarrely, an AV Club interview from actor Jonah Hill, who said that he asked Bogdanovich about the water bottle when he was drunk at a movie premiere. And in a separate interview, Bogdanovich once said, "That was my water bottle. It wasn't my idea. I was just carrying it around. I always did at that time, and they put that into the script." This guy must be the most hydrated character since Jackie Jr.'s visit to the Penguin exhibit. This smug cocksucker also seems so dry and indifferent to Melfi's issues, who cries in front of him while he just sits there blankly, waiting like patience on a monument for Tony's name to come up. The ancient Romans had a word for him. Asshole. And don't forget, scumbag. He also comes across as very meek and sheltered like his water bottle, best exemplified by his encounter with Patient Soprano, which, from the way he described it to Melfi, you'd think Tony jumped out of a tree at him with a chainsaw. That's a facile analogy. It's probably the closest Elliot has come to real danger in decades. He's what the desert people would call nebbish. And those were some tough Jews. On top of his attitude and unhelpful behaviour towards Melfi, he starts his own gossip column by telling his daughter about things Melfi told him in therapy. My estimation of him as a psychiatrist just fucking plummeted. Not to mention, Saskia is exactly the kind of pretentious name someone like him would call his daughter. And she, he, him, her, they seems just as pretentious as her, his, their dad. And what he blurts out at the therapist's dinner table is the icing on the cake. A HIPAA violation which embarrasses and humiliates Melfi. He's weak, he's out of control, and he's become an embarrassment to himself and to psychiatry. Elliot has found a safe space for himself where he can carry out an academic study of the world around him, as if he isn't really here. He's above all of this. He's just observing and studying, and the encounter with Tony spooked him because it's the closest he's come to a genuine threat in probably years. Now, I agree in spirit, but I gotta counsel, and frankly, Elliot is given a hard time by Sopranos fans. If you actually listen to what he says, he actually gives good advice and is a sharp guy, and I shouldn't have to come here, hat in hand, reminding you of the qualities of that man. It's almost like the show makes a point to have the most moral characters to also be the most unlikable, uncharismatic or annoying, like Charmaine or the Black Cop. We get so caught up in the allure of the mob that we find decent characters more reprehensible than murderers. I don't want to talk too much about Melfi in this video. She deserves her own analysis, but you can't talk about him without talking about her. And as early as season 1 in the episode The Legend of Tennessee Moltisanti, her ex-husband Richard says she can't help Tony and that eventually you're going to realize he's evil. It's pretty amazing that as early as that the show spelled it out for us and Melfi right away. David Chase has caused confusion from fans for suggesting that Tony didn't get more evil as the show went on. And maybe he was onto something. Maybe he just covered up his evilness with his charisma and the straw house in his mind where he justifies his actions, as Richard suggests. Elliot's first appearance is almost a hard cut straight into it. It's a minor revelation like, oh, the therapist also has a therapist, and all the questions that come with that. Elliot immediately picks up on her use of the phrase going on the lam, picking up Tony's influence with this mob terminology, something she criticizes him for doing later on. But in this same scene, he wisely moves her away from blaming herself for her patient's suicide, saying it would be no different to if she went on holiday. He's shrewd enough to remember phrases from previous sessions, noting how Melfi mentioned she put on weight, which he brings up in another session and asks whether it's to do with the patient. Elliot is spot on when he says, "I'm concerned that treating a mobster gives you some kind of vicarious thrill." He's also spot on in the scene where Jennifer bizarrely says speaking to Tony is therapeutic, and he retorts, "It's not supposed to be therapeutic for you, this is your therapy here." Not to mention, she says in this scene that Tony's like a little boy sometimes, when she was acting like a little girl with her attitude, calling him attractive and whatnot. Elliot is honestly very reasonable, especially in the first several sessions, recognizing almost immediately that Melfi exhibits cognitive dissonance, that she uses multiple excuses to continue seeing Tony like an abused housewife who's naively hoping her husband will change. He bluntly puts it to her, "Jennifer, I'm not challenging your ability or professionalism or even your ethics. What do you hope to achieve with this man?" Watching the Elliot scenes side by side, one after the other, you can really see Melfi's deterioration. She gets progressively worse, and this is her friend and colleague. He doesn't want to see her like this, always crying and stressed. Plus, he doesn't believe she can help Tony anyway. She starts to behave like Tony, getting upset at something Elliot says when he's trying to guide her, swearing at him, and then frustratingly walking out when he challenges her on a personal level. Not to mention, there's a narcissistic element of her claiming the eventual epiphany of a session for herself, just like what Tony does. Elliot tries repeatedly to get her to come to the inevitable conclusion that treating Tony is bad for her health, is fruitless, and she should drop him. He labels it a compulsion, classes her as obsessed, calls it her inability to bring the therapy to a conclusion, and advises her to refer him to another doctor. He can see what it is doing to her. This is sound advice. What reason is there for her to continue? And the next time the two meet, it's Melfi who is unprofessional, inadvertently blurting out Tony's name. It's frustrating because the sentence before this, she said, "Richard was right. I've been charmed by a sociopath. Why didn't I listen?" As if she was making progress before she threw the momentum of the discussion by accidentally name-dropping Tony. And it's progress Elliot was waiting for, as shown when he says, "Finally, thank you. Are you taking steps to seriously end it?" Again he advises, "You've medicated Tony Soprano. You've helped him gain whatever insight he's able to absorb. It's time to send him on to a behavioralist." Richard called her out again, saying, "You know he's an expert. The guy's conning you. It concerns me you don't see this." Something she dismisses, but in the very next scene, she is looking all giddy like a high school girl ready for the session, with Tony saying, "Is that new? Looks good," and immediately revealing he didn't make the logbook Melfi asked him to, showing he doesn't give a damn about therapy. It was all staring at her right in the face, but she didn't see it. One of Elliot's best moments is after Melfi is violated. He listens, allows her to vent, gives her a shoulder to cry on, as he says, "You have feelings of your own, and who's listening? No need to be sorry. You've been through such trauma. It takes tremendous strength and will and inner resource to soldier on as you do." He gets her to realize it wasn't her fault, saying, "Parking garages are not inherently dangerous places." He also deciphers the failing relationship between her husband and son in light of the rape. Excuse me, these fucking interruptions. There is a general feeling that he's obsessed with Tony and keeps bringing him up, but having watched his scenes again, that really isn't the case. He hardly talks about him, occasionally bringing him up, and why not? It's important for his patient. If anything, Melfi is overly sensitive about it. You can see it both ways. She gets offended one time, saying it happens too much, that Elliot is into it on a tabloid level, but he retorts that they devoted quite a chunk of last visit to him. I'm responding to that. And if he does keep bringing him up to service his mob fanaticism, perhaps he's reached a stage where he's checked out. He's tried to get her to drop him so many times, so now he just uses the talk about him to be nosy. Why not by this point? He knows she's enabling him, but she's not listening, so why not use her to feed his own curiosity? It's also worth mentioning, we're only shown the parts of the sessions that relate to Tony. So it's confirmation bias to suggest he's always talking about him, always going on about him. He could have been treating Melfi successfully for years without talking about Tony Soprano. Elliot asks her, "Think it's worth telling the police? The man is a sociopath, unpracticed in not getting what he wants. All you could come up with is this weak thing about professional ethics because you are worried about how this thug will handle rejection. You kept him a long time." Again, as she constantly does, she ignores his advice, but we all know there were times she was scared of Tony. She told Elliot that she told Tony where her son goes to college, which scared her, and of course, Tony was verbally, physically, and even sexually abusive to her. Elliot wasn't privy to Tony throwing things and being right in Melfi's face. He would have probably called the police himself if he knew. Whether it was performative concern or not, Elliot was right about Melfi's safety. Tony had forced Melfi to lam it, driven away one of her boyfriends who was beaten by Mackenzie, stolen her car, and caused her to go to the bottle. She was in crisis. He was watching her spiral out of control, and Elliot was bang on the money about Tony, saying they sharpened their tools as conmen on their therapist. We see this throughout the show, Tony using things he learned from therapy to become a better criminal, as early as him allowing Junior to become boss when Melfi suggests letting older people feel like they are in control. And she had her own selfish reasons for continuing with Tony, the feeling of safety, for example, after she was abused. Yeah, sure, he had a vested interest in talking about Tony, but that could easily be exaggerated in Melfi's psyche to paint over the cracks of why she really doesn't want to touch that particular subject. I think people miss the nuance, the dichotomy between scummy mafia voyeur Elliot versus psychiatrist Elliot. When Melfi is having a hard time of it, like an employee of the month, he turns it on and does a very good job. In the second to last episode, the legendary water bottle returns, for the first time since his first appearance, I believe. It's a bit like Chris and his cap, something he wore in his first appearance and his last appearance. It brings things full circle, brings the conversation back to its bare roots, which in this case is the worthiness of treating sociopaths. Elliot brings the receipts this time, citing the study he found about criminals sharpening their skills with psychiatry, and all she can say is, "Why are you smirking?" But anyway, as I've tried to show in this video, he was basically banging his head against a wall for years trying to get her to drop Tony, for her own sake, and by the end he finally found a study to back up his claims. It's with that context that his actions at the dinner aren't as bad as they might first appear. Sure, he was unprofessional, and it is implied he talked with colleagues about this when Melfi wasn't there, but this was essentially a last-ditch attempt to save a woman from a manipulative narcissist who had pulled the wool over her eyes. He went out of the box to get Melfi to cut Tony off, let himself be the bad guy, and it worked. This was Melfi's intervention. She had become blind to the complex which bonded her with Tony. Ultimately, it was the shaming she got from her peers, the humiliation, and ultimately her vanity which caused her to drop Tony. And even then, on the subject of professionalism, she did it very unprofessionally. Elliot attacked her with the only weapon he had, her pride. Like one colleague said at the table, "We learned that in residency," which Melfi acknowledges. They all already know this about sociopaths and criminals. It's not only futile, it's helping them in their criminal endeavors. She just didn't want to hear it. But when it's out there in the open, when everybody knows, now it's harder to keep Tony as a patient. And later, when she reads the study herself, if anything, it's her reaffirming her position for what she's now going to do, drop him. So this video is getting really long. I didn't anticipate I'd spend this long talking about Elliot Kupferberg, but it just goes to highlight the amazing writing of the show. Do you think what Elliot did was deplorable? Or do you think he was justified in what he did? What do you make of the character? Let me know in the comment section below. Subscribe to the channel and toodle fucking do.